So welcome to this week's episode of Leadership Soundbites with RokoM, Michelle, and our special guest this week. So this week, it's on the power of family. And so our special guest is Samantha Schwartz-Lenhart. She's a CEO of Blissbranding and my daughter. I'm so excited. So we have Christopher Mack to thank for this topic because Christopher, when I was doing one of the discovery calls with him and stuff, and he said, Michelle, one of the things I'd suggest for you and Roko to consider is bring your family in. And that we did the power of authenticity, and he said that's part of it. And so we'll do another episode with Roko's daughter, Maddie, but this one is with Sam. And so I'm super excited. I'm always super excited, but I'm super, super excited. It's almost like in healthcare, they go.
We can't tell, Michelle.
No, not at all. No. In healthcare, it's like a stat lab, right? And then because stat lab became the norm, it's like the stat lab. I'm like, okay, so this is the super. So I'm going to start off with this, and I guess it's a quote, but it almost feels like it's a tagline for something that it just felt appropriate. And I could so relate to it. It's use your inside voice. It's thoughts on the intersection of leadership and parenting. So that's our take on this week's The Power of Family. And the realization for me when I think about it is that leadership didn't start, when I reflect back on it, when I was intentional about developing myself as a leader. My parents started it. And I never labeled it that way before. And so this one is like, oh my God, it's crazy. And so that's where I'm coming from this time. And so, Sam, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think everyone has different situations when it comes to family, and especially the power of family. So if I look back on my career from just being a leader to now being an owner, when I reflect back on my family, I just am very lucky that my family was built very entrepreneurial. And so when you have parents that are entrepreneurs in general, you're growing up in a very different power, in a very different path. So when I used to interview people for either the company I was working for or my current company now, it's really funny when this topic came up, I actually asked them, do you have any entrepreneurial parents? Because in my mind, if they say yes, or if they say no, I'm actually going to manage that person very differently. Because when I look at someone who grew up in an entrepreneurial household, one, typically, they're going to be more vocal with me. They're going to be more transparent with me. They're going to be able to discuss their feelings more with me. They're going to be able to say, I don't like this. When you grow up in a family that has zero entrepreneurs, aunts, uncles, grandma, grandpa, no one was an entrepreneur, which is very much my husband's side of the family. You are working, you're either a really great worker, you're a horrible worker, but that energy comes back into the household. And it's always typically, because I asked my husband the same question, he said, it's always someone else's fault. I would always hear my parents saying that it's someone else's fault. And when you look at that from a leadership standpoint and from a management standpoint, it's mind-blowingly different. And that's okay. You're just being able to now manage someone very differently. And so the last point about this, until you move on to, your next question, is I went to a conference and it was about recruiting. And I've been to many conferences about hiring people, but it was about recruiting, and it was odd because the speaker never brought up this entrepreneurial point. And now when you came with this podcast topic, I actually went up to this speaker afterwards and I said, in your list of questions that you ask people, why don't you ask them if they have entrepreneurial parents? And I kind of explained the same thing. And she looked at me and she said, wow, these are one of those moments where you're going to go, I met someone at a conference once and I'm going to add this in now. She said, I don't know. And we really kind of went in depth a little bit about those two paths, but at a very high level, that power is so different, right? And so bringing that in as a leader is pretty transformative.
God, that's crazy. Roko, I want you to step in and comment on stuff, but my brain is like,
I know.
boom, 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 boom.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that stood out to me is, as you were talking, is it goes back to that experiences form our beliefs that then form our actions that drive our results. And all of those things that we learn as children from our parents shape our work life, our personal life as adults. And earlier in the podcast, before we started, I was sharing when Michelle shared the topic with me that the inside voice was something that was always a topic for me growing up, because I'm so loud. I don't have a library voice, but reflecting back as an adult now, it's all about being aware of your surroundings and managing that voice level and that energy with the people in the room. And I think it's carried over into what I do now with coaching and executive learning, or leadership learning. And
yeah, it's funny because there's thoughts from what Sam said, which I went, oh my God, ping, 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 right? And then thoughts on what you just said, because I'll start there. So thoughts on what you just said is it is about situational awareness, right? So if you go into a room with a bunch of executives, who are you showing up as? Who do you need to be?
Yeah. And who do they need you to be?
Exactly. So people talk about presence, right? And so what presence are you showing up with in what room? Is it a coaching presence? Is it an executive presence, a leadership presence? Am I, with my buddies having a beer? They're different energies, how we show up with. That's that comment that my brain went on that little journey, right? The other one, Sam, when you were talking, my brain went back to, I was self-employed. We were self-employed that way. And I never for a moment thought about the impact that could have on your kids as they're thinking and growing up. And I think the courage that it gives them to step out and do something different. The other thing that came to mind for me is when you were talking about, and I'm going to say people that, to your point, W-2 that work for somebody else. And what came to mind for me is below the line, above the line, right? And so below the line is around this victim mode that we have no control over, or perceive that we have no control over our situation, our surroundings. And so I think it's true, depending on leadership in organizations, people can feel that way. If it's top down, they can feel powerless. But it all lands on leadership, whether or not someone working for someone else comes home feeling like my hands are tied, everything's being done to me, versus feeling empowered. And it was just, I hadn't thought of it that way. So it was interesting. So there's my ping, ping, ping stuff that went off, right? It was just like, holy cow.
Yeah, I would think, when I really thought about this topic, that's from more of a leadership standpoint. And I always say, it's okay if someone doesn't want to be a leader, right? Because you're put on this planet as who you are. But learning how to manage those people, when you're a leader, it's such a huge responsibility, because you just shape people's lives and you don't even, know how much you shape them. So it's a really big responsibility. So if you don't want that, we get it. But when you do have that responsibility, you're choosing that, it's important to continue education all the time to, for your people, be transparent for your people. But when I think back, okay, what are these two things that I see reflected in myself all the time? What made me become a CEO? What made me want to be a leader? And work just tons and tons of hours, but love it. I love what I do. And the two biggest things, and I just said this to someone I just hired, and I took a moment and I thought, this is really from my parents. So two things. One, because both my parents were entrepreneurs. Number one is
they still are.
Still are. They still are. And I'm still a kid.
And they're not dead.
Yes. Number one is the power of positivity. And you guys have done an entire segment on this. The power behind someone actually having a positive attitude or a positive outlook on life. As an owner of a company, I will pay 3x for someone coming in that has a positive attitude. Now, initially, maybe not, because over time you see, well, this person's very optimistic and they have a positive attitude. I will bonus them more. I will give them a raise that's higher than the person next to them that does not have that. And are you born with positivity? Sure, some people are naturally optimistic. Can you learn it? 100%. And that person, to me, this is my experience. Now I'm 37, but that person in life is going to make more money and inevitably be happier. That's just my experience. So that was the first thing I learned going into situations. Are you going to be negative about stuff? 100%. But how you show up, if you're more positive than the person sitting next to you, if that's your goal every day, I'm going to wake up a little more positive than I was yesterday. You will make more money. And if not, you know, my mom's going to give you my contact information and let me know. I'll pay you the difference. I'm telling you. But number two is the ability for that person to be a problem solver and not have to come to you, but come to you solving the problem creatively. And that's where I think back as an entrepreneur, there's never an excuse because you're it, right? The buck stops with you. And so if you don't solve the problem, there's no one behind you that's going to solve it. And so even though it wasn't very direct coming home to my kids, you know, today I solved this problem, kids, you know, it wasn't that, but I grew up in an environment where when you talked about a problem, suddenly the next day or the next week, there was the solution. If the car broke down, there was the solution. It wasn't, oh my God, we're not going to be able to do something. We're not going to be able to do this. It's the littlest things. And when I look back, I just said to an employee literally 3 days ago, I said, can I just tell you something? I said, I'm sure your parents, I physically said these words, I'm sure your parents have said this to you, but I need to say it to you. And I said, please never change. You're so optimistic. I hear you having conversations with other people and I hear you saying, but look at the artwork that was on the Riverwalk with all the homeless people. And those moments of let me look at the brighter side is so refreshing. And it's because I don't like drama. I think it's just a waste of energy. Number two, coming to me with these solutions. Now he runs a lot of social media accounts for me, coming to solutions with, hey, we could do X, Y, and Z. And it's things that I'm not thinking about that is a problem for the client. And I'm going, so good at solving problems. Like, yeah, and I said to him, someday you will be a millionaire. I don't want you to work for me forever. You're going to, because you have these characteristics and please never change. So those are the just really big takeaways.
I love that. I love that. And it got me reflecting about my own life. I was like, you know, where did my problem solving come from? Right. And my dad was an entrepreneur. My grandparents were entrepreneurs. And even my mom, even though she worked for someone, she wasn't an entrepreneur, but there was this always, if you saw a problem, solve it. And it goes back to, I can't remember who shared this in one of our trainings, but it was a finder fixer ratio of 1. And so you don't let whatever is in front of you stop you. There is some way, some possible way of getting through it, around it. So it just.
There's a couple things come to mind. One of them, and people listening are gonna go, what? My father, because part of what I'm hearing is like accountability, responsibility, right? The buck stops here. And that's what you were saying, Sam. There's no one else in line to solve this stuff. But my dad, I remember when my sister and I were growing up, there would be I'm just going to say a piece of trash or whatever on the floor. And he would come to us and go, so this has been here for 3 days. And no one has picked it up. And I'm thinking, what? You saw it. Why didn't you pick it up? I didn't say that. Okay. But he was creating awareness for us that take ownership for it. So you may not have been the one that put the trash on the floor, but you can be the one to pick it up. And so while both my parents, they weren't entrepreneurs, well, my dad was later on in life, but not while I was growing up. They had this, the roles that they had were problem solving roles. Yeah. They were about creating solutions. And, my mom was in banking and dad was with the Air Force, designing electronics and programming computers, but it was all about designing solutions. So it wasn't, I'm a role in here, and they weren't leaders per se, but they exhibited leadership. And the other thing I remember, and I think Sam, I was sharing this with you, my mom, I remember when I was younger, that for whatever reason, I did not like the arrangement of the furniture in the living room. Don't ask me why. Okay. And I guess I complained about it. And she said, well, you live here too. How would you change it? And I mean, when I think back on that, we were talking about this topic, I thought, that's empowering your team. I'm the team, right? One of them. And those kind of things, they never stopped me. I mean, it was like, I can do this.
Yeah. Yeah. Michelle, what came to me, a couple of things came to me. One around the trash piece is everybody has responsibility. Everybody has, for that coexistence, if you will. And in the Japanese culture, when I went and visited Japan, it's like they're on an island and everybody has a responsibility to reduce waste on the island because there's only so much space and you have to preserve it. So they literally have no trash cans anywhere in the public spaces because people know if they bring trash in, they're going to have to take it back with them. So a lot of the things are not, disposable kind of things. They're very cognizant of that. So it was like that part of it. And then the story about the furniture, it's about, you have a voice, use it. And it doesn't matter where you are in the hierarchy, because there is a hierarchy of family too. And the same applies to business. Everybody has a voice and don't be afraid to use that voice. So I love that.
Oh yeah. The little
reflection is it's so exciting to do this reflection.
Yeah, no, it's funny.
So I was chatting with a client the other day, and this is really interesting. It's very relevant to this topic. And they have a massive engineering firm. They have over 200 employees. And so he says to me, when I'm chatting with him about recruiting, because it's an issue for everyone right now. And he says, when I'm recruiting leadership, he says, I ask them, and he says, it's not probably very compliant, but I do explain why I asked the question, do you have children? And he says, these are people that have experience, right? They're 40s, 50s, 60 years old, and they either say yes or no. And he says, I tell them right afterwards, whatever their answer is, I find that when leaders have children, they approach their team differently because your work is your work family. And I have leaders that have children that I notice manage differently. So when I have roles in mind, I know who I need in that role that has children because they have grown up with different experience, teaching them just like, grandpa did to you, mom, here's the trash on the floor, as opposed to others. Can you learn it all the time? But he is being very aware of the fact he knows his team, who do I want to place where and why, which I find fascinating, right? Because
you're absolutely right. There's HR compliance issues with doing that. It's a huge no.
Yes, this is very
absolutely right. So yeah, some context setting before the question comes out may be helpful.
Yes.
But the other thing that came to mind for me is, if you think about it, when you have children, and when you have children and you're raising them, you grow up with them. And so if I think about it, there's no one else on the planet that I would have handed over the money that I make to help buy a car or to go to camp or whatever. I mean, but you do that for your children. And so if you think about that in terms of servant leadership, you're absolutely right. I think that's the developing piece around servant leadership, is that someone else is first. You're in service to them. It's interesting.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought about it.
Yeah.
Wouldn't have thought about it that way.
Yeah.
So I've so appreciated this time. And it took me on places that I did not expect to go. Jim Rohn had a quote that the most difficult leadership role is around the most difficult leadership role being a parent. And I didn't think about it that way, but I think it is a critical part of our leadership development, or lessons that we can learn from our parents that I never thought was packaged that way. So what I want to do is, Sam, if you can, what's one thing you want people to walk away with from the time that we've talked together?
I think, if our audience is leaders or executives or people looking to better themselves, I think back, even yesterday, I was out with my kids. One of them, he's almost 6. And we were walking down a main street and he saw an art gallery, and which is funny for a 6-year-old, but he saw a painting and it was literally about this big. He says, "Mom, I really want that." And I said, "Really?" Yeah, he says, "I think it's really cool." And I said, art is really cool. I said, "Well, let's go in and see how much it is." So this little painting is beautiful. Oil painting is $28. And I looked at him and we walked back out the store because it's a gallery and I also have a 2-year-old. So we walked back out to discuss the $28. And I said, "I won't make you pay me money." I said, "But what will you pay me in another way?" And he says, "I don't know what you mean." I said, "Well, washing the dishes is an example, but you're not going to wash them because they're all glass. So that's not an example." And so he looks at me and he says, "I will listen for 5 days."
What?
And I'm like, "What?" "Okay, listen, 20. I said, "It's just not enough." And he says, "I don't understand what you mean." And I said, "You should be listening anyways." And in that moment, he looked at me and he said, "Okay, I don't want it anymore." And without even thinking, in the sidewalk on this main street, I looked at him and I said, "Don't ever do that again. I don't want to see that. And it's a trait that I don't ever want to see again. If you really want something, you will work for it. You will work hard for it. And everything that you want in life, you will work even harder than the person next to you." And I said, "The person next to you is 2. I said, "So right now he would probably work harder than you." And I said, "I don't want to see this anymore." I said, "So if you're going to listen for 5 days, what else are you going to do?" And he says, "Okay, I'm sorry." Kind of maybe understood what I was saying. And he says, "I'll be nice to Reese." I said, "Done. Okay, 5 days, 100% you're nice to Reese, his brother," right? But long story short, you're always teaching. And I think as a leader, it's such a responsibility to never doubt yourself and really listen to your gut and let you have experience and you have wisdom, which is why you're in that role. And when you let that come out, because you're constantly wanting to better someone else, no matter what it is, let that come out. I think that's what makes a leader amazing. Not having to be a parent to someone, they already have parents, but that knowledge that is coming from somewhere, right? You're like, "Why in that moment did I even do that? I could have walked and saved $28. But for some reason, I wanted to make this moment." And it literally goes back to an example that I saw from my parents. And you don't ever give up, and you will work hard, and it takes hard work in life. And so that is just a big takeaway, I think, with the power of family, trusting your gut, learning, and really going, I have this from somewhere, and it's probably from my parents, right? Unless you believe that you live multiple lives, which some people do. So yeah, it's a big takeaway.
Thank you. Poor Cannon.
I know, just a piece of art, Mom.
I don't want it anymore. I give up.
Not worth the effort.
You can't give up. It's not an option.
Oh, man.
Oh my God, Roko.
So I think there is power in family, but do the reflection. I think this podcast opened my eyes to that. Is start with reflecting to see what that intersection has been for you around parenting or family and your leadership style today. And if there are aspects of it to your story that aren't supporting you being the leader that you want to be, change them. If they are, it's great to have that understanding and awareness of where it might have come from, where it was rooted in.
Thank you. When I think about all the stuff that you said, and then the power of family and this broadcast, I think it's piggybacking on what both of you have said around the reflection piece too, is that take the moments, because I'm gonna cry.
It's very emotional with family.
Oh, my parents are both gone. And so I think this has brought smiles and memories to stuff that I'm like, who tells someone this trash has been on the floor for 3 days?
Right.
But I take the time. Take the time to walk down memory lane and then figure out that stuff and then bring those stories into your leadership journey, because it creates those moments of people laughing, and it's going to, like we just did here, then all of a sudden people start remembering their connections and their memories and their leadership journey. And that can bring people together. That can bring your team together when you start creating those connections. So that's my takeaway. And that's what I hope you think about, is that walk down memory lane, look at how much of where you came from and how you grew up and those particular moments impacted you as a leader. So thank you. This has been Leadership Soundbites, RokoM, Michele, and Sam. And I look forward to next time. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
All right.
Bye.